So in Daniel chapter 7, we're now coming to the conclusion of the first half of the book. And in fact, from here right through to the end of the book is all Bible prophecy. Many of the other narrative events that are woven through some initial dreams and interpretations of those dreams have occurred. But here we've got now the conclusion of what's this initial chiasm or view of what God's sovereign plan is for Israel, for the nations, for mankind through the rest of human history. And as we go through and conclude this, what essentially we get from chapter 7 onwards is a summary of events past, present, and future. Not only in the life of Daniel as he is writing and recording these things, also too through the life and ministry of Jesus Christ when he was here on earth, right through the church age to the time he comes back and beyond. Because here encapsulated is God's sovereign plan for the world. And we see this depicted for us through a dream that Daniel receives, depicted by 4 beasts. And as we'll look at, this actually mirrors a dream that Nebuchadnezzar had had back in chapter 2. But I understand that there is a lot in here, and if this is your first time going through Daniel, there can be a bit to take in, especially when we look at Daniel and books like Revelation and so on. And so, time permitting, what I'd hope to do at the conclusion of the service today is something a little bit different. Is just open the floor just to some questions. If you've got any burning questions on anything that doesn't make sense or you'd like clarified, tuck that away and hold that to the end, and we'll seek to address that together if there's time. But remember those things. But let's just bring the initial set of chapters to a conclusion today. Because as I've been mentioning from week to week, chapters 2 through to 7 of Daniel form, in academic speak, is what's known as a chiasm. These are 3 pairs of stories and events which mirror one another to point to one central truth. And as you can see, if you're looking at this slide, at the center of that is God's sovereignty. God's sovereign hand is upon all people of the earth, no matter how low or how high those people are. Because beginning and ending these chapters, we have essentially a depiction of the Gentile nations rising to power, a sequence of these empires, one after the other. And whilst Israel themselves are in captivity and they're struggling to understand what is God doing here, time and time again we have this picture of God sovereignly delivering his faithful people, all in the midst of this persecution. But it drives to one end, that God is sovereign, and he is sovereign over all events of human history. No king is too great, so he humbles Nebuchadnezzar, and he deposes Belshazzar and brings in the next stage or the next kingdom that flows through from this. In fact, Daniel chapter 7, and you could extend that to the whole of the book of Daniel, is the most comprehensive summary of world events and Bible prophecy of God speaking through Daniel right through to us today. And just as Daniel is to the Old Testament, that central book, so is Revelation in the New Testament. In fact, you need to have one with the other. Many people have made mistakes over the years by trying to interpret Revelation separate to the rest of the Bible, and Daniel separate to the rest of the Bible. But to understand the pictures, the visions, and all these different things, we need to take the Bible from cover to cover, Genesis right through to Revelation, and see what does God have to say about his plan for human history. It's got nothing to do with our plan or any plan of any government or ruler or power that would stand up to him. What does God have to say? And we find that in these chapters. So by way of quick recap, and we're not going to go back through these events, that was something we covered in detail in chapter 2. But if you remember, very early on in Daniel's exile, so Nebuchadnezzar in his 2nd year of reign had a dream, and he called the sorcerers, the enchanters, the magicians, and all those Babylonian wise men to try and tell him not only the dream, but then the interpretation. They failed dismally to tell the dream, but God revealed the dream to Daniel, and therefore to the interpretation of that dream, which when we consider that was a succession of 4 empires. What the king had dreamed was a statue with a head of gold, followed by chest and arms of silver, a waist of bronze, 2 legs of iron, which then gave way to feet mixed with iron and with clay, and at the end of those feet are 10 toes. we learned from that account of this being a succession of empires, beginning with Nebuchadnezzar himself. He was the head of gold, as Daniel had said in the dream. But that empire, the Babylonian Empire, would be succeeded by another. And so we saw the Medo-Persians come to power at the end of Belshazzar's reign. He was deposed, the next kingdom came. Followed by the Medo-Persian kingdom would be the Greeks. They would sweep through the kingdom and take over very rapidly. And after their reign would be the Roman Empire. But the debate will be then, what happened after that? Because from the dream, what we have the understanding of is that the Roman Empire would divide. And this happened after the time of Jesus, indicating that this picture, this dream, did not conclude with the first coming of Jesus Christ. It leads us to the logical conclusion that there are future events to unfold. And we have to consider then, what is the deal with these feet? And what about these 10 toes that we will learn today are representative of 10 kings and 10 rulers? What is the correct way to interpret all of this? But in spite of all of these successions of kingdoms, there is one yet to come. And that was a stone that was cut from a mountain, not by human hand. This was a picture of God and the kingdom of Christ coming, but that would do away with all other kingdoms prior. It would destroy the statue and it would just pass away. But note that that dream was speaking of a succession or a timeline of events, of 4 major empires followed by some other form of empire at the end of the Roman one, but would conclude human history with Christ's kingdom and him ruling and reigning forever. As we now come to Daniel chapter 7, this is now Daniel having a dream. And he is dreaming of 4 beasts. What we'll learn when we look at this account is these 4 beasts are representative of those different first 4 stages of that statue, and then more detail around what we understand of these feet and these toes. But it's done in a different way of depicting other animals and beasts. So as we pick this up, let's just look at the first aspect of this dream. In fact, the whole chapter is the dream of Daniel, but let's just look at the first 8 verses and then make some initial observations off that as we work through these. Daniel chapter 7, reading from verse 1. In the first year of Belshazzar, king of Babylon, Daniel saw a dream and visions of his head as he lay in his bed. Then he wrote down the dream and told the sum of the matter. Daniel declared, I saw in my vision by night, and behold, the 4 winds of heaven were stirring up the great sea. And 4 great beasts came out of the sea, different from one another. The first was like a lion and had eagle's wings. Then, as I looked, its wings were plucked off, and it was lifted up from the ground and made to stand on 2 feet like a man. And the mind of a man was given to it. And behold, another beast, a second one like a bear. It was raised up on one side. It had 3 ribs in its mouth between its teeth. And it was told, arise, devour much flesh. After this I looked, and behold another, like a leopard, with 4 wings of a bird on its back. And the beast had 4 heads, and dominion was given to it. After this I saw in the night visions, and behold, a 4th beast, terrifying and dreadful and exceedingly strong. It had great iron teeth. It devoured and broke in pieces and stamped what was left with its feet. It was different from all the beasts that were before it, and it had 10 horns. I considered the horns, and behold, there came up among them another horn, a little one, before which 3 of the first horns were plucked up by the roots. And behold, in this horn were eyes like the eyes of a man, and a mouth speaking great things. Just the first quick observation on this is we note that this is now written in the first year of Belshazzar, king of Babylon. We know Belshazzar, if we're looking at this sequentially, Belshazzar's already been deposed. But now, to conclude this chiasm, we're stepping back to the first year of Belshazzar's reign when Daniel actually had this dream. It's something that troubled him, and he tucked that away, sitting with that for some time. But as we work through this dream, what we need to understand are a few basic rules of Bible interpretation, especially when it comes to prophecy. Because here we have a number of beasts, much symbol and pictures and things that are thrown at us that are unlike anything that we know in the natural world. And in order to understand Bible prophecy, we need to know a few things. The first is, what do these symbols mean? This is where, by way of summary, we need to let the Bible interpret the Bible. If we don't, in fact, there's a saying that says, if the plain sense makes common sense, seek no other sense, or else it will lead to nonsense. Because typically speaking, is if we look at these things and we try to interpret what these symbols mean, there's nothing to compare them to in the natural. And so if we leave it up to our own imaginations, we could make them say whatever we'd like them to say. And that's been done through the years. But again, as I said, we need to let the Bible interpret the Bible. And in order to understand what these things mean, typically, and I can say this, that in all cases, every symbol used in the Bible is interpreted somewhere else. So we can't go making things up. We need to first and foremost see, what does the Bible have to say? To do so, we begin with the immediate context. Is there anything within the text itself that tells us what these things mean? And in fact, in this dream later, Daniel is asking for an interpretation of these events, and it's given to us. We learn that these beasts represent kings and kingdoms to come. Yet, in this particular instance, though, we don't have all the detail. Because what we see are some very strange things. A lion with wings, a leopard with 4 heads and also 4 wings on its back, a bear. Of course, a bear is not really depicted in other strange ways. But then there's this 4th terrifying beast, unlike anything that Daniel's seen. So how do we interpret these things? And so we need to look not only in the immediate context, but then also elsewhere in Scripture. What are these things, and does the Bible elsewhere tell us what these symbols mean? Take, for example, now as Daniel has this dream and is understanding that, in verse 2 we see that in this vision he beholds the 4 winds of heaven stirring up the great sea. So again, what are these 4 winds of heaven? Well, are there 4 winds? Do we see or feel the wind? We certainly feel the wind, but we may not see it. But what does the Bible say about this? Because the 4 winds, when used symbolically through the prophets, right across the Bible, they are used in many respects to the same word is used of spirits. And it could be that these are 4 spirits of God used to stir up the great sea. But also another depiction of 4 used in that context too. We'll see time and time again the 4 winds, or the 4 directions, or the 4 corners of the earth. Now we know that the earth is round, unless you're a flat earther, maybe then that's up to debate, but the earth is round when seen from space. The earth doesn't have corners. So of course we can't make anything of that, but we'll look at the context. Is this meaning something symbolic? And usually we're thinking the 4 corners of the earth of north, south, east and west. And here if we put these together, we've got 4 spirits perhaps, 4 corners of the earth, 4 winds stirred up, but they're stirring the great sea. What now is this sea? Now used in a literal sense. The Great Sea is mentioned numerous times through the book of Joshua and also later in Ezekiel 47. The Great Sea referring simply to the Mediterranean. But the sea can also be used in a symbolic sense. Jesus did that in Matthew 13 with the parable of the net, mentioning that the sea being the Gentile nations, of all the nations, and that's where the gospel and the harvest is coming from. Also too, it's used throughout Isaiah. And so I'm not making this up. I can give you some references to look up later. But it is used to depict the nations in Isaiah 17:12, in chapter 21 verse 1, chapter 23 verses 4 and 11. In Isaiah 27:1, it says that the Lord will punish Leviathan, the twisting serpent, and slay the dragon that is in the sea. When we look through the scriptures, and that dragon is a depiction of Satan that is working in the sea, being the Gentile nations. So again, we're just letting the Bible interpret itself for us. So we don't have to read into it anything, we read out of it what it has to say. Also, what we'll look at is these events can also be seen in Revelation chapter 13, of another beast rising out of the sea that has 10 horns. Much of the detail in Revelation can also be looked at in light of what we will examine today here in Daniel chapter 7. So in order to apply these rules of interpretation to the text, what we need to first understand are these 4 beasts. Again, the direct parallel is to the dream that King Nebuchadnezzar had in chapter 2. The head of gold, chest and arms of silver, the waist of bronze, and the legs of iron, representing the Babylonian, Medo-Persian, the Greek, and then the Roman empires. And this is really easy. It's given for us, and it doesn't take much imagination to see how these relate. But the focus, though, is not on these first three beasts. What we'll note later on is that the one that draws most attention and consternation from Daniel is this fourth beast, because it's unlike anything else that he's ever seen, even in a vision or a dream or in real life. But let's look at the first three beasts initially. Note the depiction of the first being like a lion, verse 4, and it had eagle's wings, and as I looked, its wings were plucked off, and it was lifted up from the ground and made to stand on 2 feet like a man, and the mind of man was given to it. Remembering back to chapter 2, this one's easy. This represents the Babylonian Empire. And there are details in that too, even depicted here like a lion. So it's not exactly a lion, it's like, because this lion also has wings. Now, the primary symbol for Babylon, as we see in archaeological evidence, is a lion. And in some statues and pictures, the lion is also shown to have eagle's wings. So here, this one's a no-brainer. We obviously understand that to be Babylon relating to that head of gold from the earlier dream. But notice too that its wings were plucked, so speaking of humiliation, but then again made to stand up with 2 feet like a man, with the mind of man given to it. We consider this in chapter 4 of Daniel, as Nebuchadnezzar was humbled for 7 periods of time and then restored once he'd learned his lesson. So that one's easy. We move now to the next beast in verse 5. Behold, another beast, a second one like a bear. It was raised upon one side, and it had 3 ribs in its mouth between its teeth. And it was told, arise, devour much flesh. So, if the first beast represented Babylon, what does the second beast likely represent? The Medo-Persian kingdom. And we actually see that depicted by a bear. A bear in this part of the world being the second most ferocious predator. And it had tremendous strength. It would crush its prey and also rip its prey. And it's told here, arise and devour much flesh. We see that this bear is raised up on one side. And that depicts then these 2 kingdoms, the Medes and the Persians, having come together to conquer. And the Persians were much stronger than the Medes, Cyrus being the primary and initial ruler of the Persians. But this bear has 3 ribs in its mouth. What do the events of history tell us? Well, the Medo-Persian Empire, they came to power and they quickly conquered the Babylonian Empire, the Lydian Empire, and the Egyptian empires. It leads us to believe then that these 3 ribs represent these 3 empires, and as they came to power, they ruled and reigned for 208 years until the Greeks came through, Alexander the Great. What do we learn of this third beast then that may look like this Greek empire that came to power? In the following verse, 6, after this I looked, and behold another, like a leopard, with 4 wings of a bird on its back, and the beast had 4 heads, and dominion was given to it. We know from history too that Alexander the Great rose to power and he conquered territory faster than you could possibly imagine. Just like a leopard and with wings, moving with great speed. In fact, it's been believed that looking at historical records that Alexander the Great even pointed to Daniel chapter 7 as indicating that God had appointed for him to be the one to sweep through. Already, we've got other nations looking at prophetic texts. And that was justification for Alexander the Great to sweep through those empires and come to power. And he did that with rapid speed. And in fact, his reign was only 13 years, from 336 BC to 323 BC. But note that this leopard moved fast, but it had 4 heads. What happened upon the death of Alexander the Great? His 4 generals came to power, and they took control of 4 different regions of the kingdom, roughly speaking to the north, south, east, and west of this new empire. Again, the details are looking quite accurate, which is stunning, not only here, but also as we progress through the subsequent chapters. Why people have looked at how accurate this prophecy is, they've sought to late date Daniel. Rather than it have been written during the time of Daniel physically here, it's said to have been written after the fact, because many secular scholars just simply can't handle the fact that God knows what he's doing and he will predict these events, and gave all this detail to Daniel. What do they have to do is then play some gymnastics to try and post-date it. But these events are stunningly accurate. But those three kingdoms are easy. What do we do with the fourth? Now, if this is to represent the Roman Empire, it's a little bit different in terms of the detail here. Because note, reading on from verse 7, after this, I saw in the night visions, and behold, a fourth beast, terrifying and dreadful and exceedingly strong. It had great iron teeth. It devoured and broke into pieces and stamped what was left with its feet. It was different from all the other beasts that were before it, and it had 10 horns. And we'll look at the horns and the following verse in a moment. But here we've got a different beast. And we note too from the description here, it's different from the rest. So here, this one is unlike any other creature. You can't relate it to a lion, a bear, a leopard, or anything existent. So we can only begin to imagine. Many artists have tried to draw what Daniel perhaps saw. But clearly it was unlike anything he knew of. But here, this is terrifying and dreadful and exceedingly strong. It had great iron teeth, and the word iron here makes us also think back to the legs of iron in Nebuchadnezzar's dream as well. Again, the same sort of metal here, and we know iron is very, very strong. And here are these iron teeth. And it devoured and broke into pieces and stamped what was left with its feet. This was very much the Roman Empire when it came to power. It was strong. And they would just swarm and just take over that whole empire. They had tremendous strength as they went through their years of reign. But note that he says that this was different from all of the other beasts, because at the end of verse 7, it had 10 horns. The number 10 is significant too, because remember the statue? It had 10 toes. So maybe there is something between these 10 toes and these 10 horns. And this is now what's different, is because in Nebuchadnezzar's dream, we were looking originally at a timeline of events. Here, what Daniel is doing with this dream is he's showing us additional detail about each and every one of these kingdoms. This last beast has 10 horns. And then as we will read, and we'll see another horn rises up, and a certain sequence of events happens after that. Verse 8, I considered the horns, and behold, there came up among them another horn, a little one, before which 3 of the first horns were plucked up by the roots. And behold, in this horn were the eyes like the eyes of a man, and a mouth speaking great things. So here, 10 horns, 10 toes now, another horn. This is a detail that we haven't seen in the earlier dream. One additional horn rises up and takes over, as it would seem, 3 of those other horns. And so as we move through this, and there's more detail yet to come, but the dream continues now, and we have a change in focus. Looking at verses 9 onwards now, there is another character that comes onto the scene, and that is the Ancient of Days. As I looked, thrones were placed, and the Ancient of Days took his seat. His clothing was white as snow, and the hair of his head like pure wool. His throne was fiery flames, its wheels were burning fire. A stream of fire issued and came out from before him. 1,000,000 served him, and 10,000 times 10,000 stood before him. The court sat in judgment, and the books were opened. Now, 2 guesses as to who the Ancient of Days could be. Now, if you thought it's either God the Father or Jesus the Son, you'd be correct. But obviously, it can't be Jesus the Son, because he is depicted further down in verse 13 and 14. So it leads us to the obvious conclusion that the Ancient of Days is God the Father sitting on the throne. But what is interesting too is the language and description used here is very similar to the language used in Revelation chapter 1 to describe Jesus, with whiteness and hair like wool and so on. And perhaps the linkage is quite different, deliberate rather, to have these two linked in our minds. That Jesus the Son and God the Father all being as one, but here the Ancient of Days being God the Father. Note the description, his clothing was white as snow, and the hair of his head like pure wool. White hair and wool being pure. We get this picture of purity and of righteousness, of God who is right and just above all things, taking his seat on the throne. But we note then the depiction of this throne because there is a stream of fire that's issuing from it. And we also see these fiery flames and these wheels of burning fire. Where have we seen wheels of burning fire elsewhere in the scriptures? Well, that one's easy. Ezekiel chapters 1 and 10. We've got those 4 wheels, those burning fiery wheels depicted before the throne. So that would be some other detail to turn to if we'd like to take a tangent and look at those as well. But of course we can't for time. But also note what's serving around the throne. We have myriads of angels. 10,000 times 10,000. 10,000 being the highest number you can count to in the Greek. And he's wanting to show that this is an innumerable number of angels. 10,000 times 10,000, thousands of thousands. Language, again, that's picked up in the book of Revelation. So here, this is God the Father taking his seat on the throne. But note, at the end of verse 10, the court sat in judgment and the books were opened. Because here, what we're essentially looking at is a time of judgment. Because using even the language back in verse 9, thrones were placed, and then the Ancient of Days coming in. Picture the scene, perhaps in a movie or a TV show, or if you're in a physical courtroom, when everyone's told, all rise, everyone stands, and the judge comes in and takes his seat before everyone sits down with him. We've got a scene playing out of a courtroom. Judgment is about to take place. The judge is in his seat, and books are opened. A picture here of the book of the law, because judgment that is about to be enacted is in accordance with the righteous standards of God the Father. But note the focus of this judgment, because that's where we look at in verses 11 and 12. I looked then because of the sound of the great words that the horn was speaking. There is something about this one little horn that seems to be speaking and boasting a great many things. We'll pick up further detail of this as we work our way through the rest of Daniel. But note that that is the focus of this one little horn. But through that, as I looked, Daniel says, the beast was killed, its body destroyed and given over to be burned by fire. And as for the rest of the beasts, their dominion was taken away, but their lives were prolonged for a season and a time. So this 4th beast is going to meet a terrible end. It's going to be killed, its body destroyed, and burned with fire. If we were looking at the parallel accounts in Revelation, we would see this fire and leap to the obvious conclusion that this is referring to the lake of fire, the ultimate place of judgment yet to come. But all the other beasts, that is the first 3 beasts, note that they have their dominion taken away, but they're prolonged for a time. It's as if this 4th beast is destroyed, but the other ages, these Gentile nations and so on, they're allowed to continue. And before the judgment is concluded, this is going to continue for a time. And again, there's more detail on this yet to come. But our attention now looking not only at this courtroom, this scene in heaven, with the Ancient of Days taking the throne, judgment about to take place, there is another character that enters the scene, and that is the Son of Man. Verse 13, I saw in the night visions, and behold, with the clouds of heaven, there came one like a son of man. And he came to the Ancient of Days and was presented before him. And to him was given dominion and glory and a kingdom, that all peoples, nations, and languages should serve him. His dominion is an everlasting dominion which shall not pass away, and his kingdom one that shall not be destroyed. Note the depiction here is Son of Man. This is something that Jesus used to self-describe himself as he was serving in his ministry here on earth, and we can read that all throughout the gospel accounts. Here is a clear linkage to Jesus Christ himself, but also then his coming, because all the nations, the peoples, the languages are going to serve him. Jesus will be coming in clouds of glory. At his second coming, every eye will see him and every knee is going to have to bow and give an account to him. But note in verse 13, he is now presented before the Ancient of Days. And then in verse 14, dominion of everything is given to him. Now, I wish we actually had another hour at our disposal today, and with the whole changeover with daylight savings, I guess, do I have an extra hour? No, perhaps not today, but if we had the time, it'd be very interesting to look at Revelation chapters 4 and 5 and Revelation chapter 20, because that is also another summary of these events in verses 13 and 14 of Daniel 7. In Revelation chapters 4 and 5, this, and if you're taking a futurist view of the interpretation of Revelation, these occur at the end of the church age, when there will be a scene in heaven and the Ancient of Days sits on the throne and Jesus Christ, the one who alone is worthy to open the scroll of judgment that is about to befall the earth, and he alone can take the scroll and open its contents, because Jesus Christ will receive all dominion and authority over all things. And that is depicted for us in technicolor detail in Revelation chapters 4 and 5. Fast forward through the subsequent chapters and we have those judgments being poured out on the nations. But in chapter 20 is then Christ ruling and reigning for 1,000 years here on earth. And then at the end of that time is the great white throne judgment. And he will have all dominion. Those details then are summarized. Again, here is Daniel giving us the scaffolding. Revelation gives us all the detail that helps us flesh it all out. So moving beyond this, and again, we don't have the time to analyze that in great detail today, but see how we go in either the question and answer time or over subsequent weeks. But we need to put our attention this morning on this fourth beast, the most complicated and the one that sort of was perplexing Daniel. This was really the focus of the dream for him. Because now Daniel, as we learn in verse 15, as for me, Daniel, my spirit within me was anxious, and the visions of my head alarmed me. I approached one of those who stood there and asked him the truth concerning all this. So he told me and made known to me the interpretation of the things. Here, Daniel is still in this vision and in this dream. And he's going to one of the individuals within there, just like, well, what does this all mean? And he probably already has an idea of what the other beasts mean. And in fact, there's an interpretation quickly given. But again, Daniel's wondering, what is this fourth beast? But here he's perplexed. He asks the question. So the interpretation then of these beasts is given for him in simple form. These four great beasts are four kings who shall arise out of the earth. But the saints of the Most High shall receive the kingdom and possess the kingdom forever, forever, and ever. So that makes sense. I mean, considering the dream we've already looked at, Daniel's going, yeah, okay, that's fine. But still, it's not enough to satisfy his curiosity. There's more detail in this dream that he just cannot figure out. So he still has more questions. Look at verses 19 through to 22. Then I desired to know the truth about the fourth beast, which was different from all the rest, exceedingly terrifying, with its teeth of iron and claws of bronze, which devoured and broke in pieces and stamped what was left with its feet. And about the 10 horns that were on its head, and the other horn that came up, and before which 3 of them fell, the horn that had the eyes and mouth that spoke great things, that seemed greater than its companions. As I looked, this horn made war with the saints and prevailed over them, until the Ancient of Days came and judgment was given for the saints of the Most High. And the time came when the saints possessed the kingdom. Now, much of this is what we'd seen depicted before, so in a way it's a summary of what he's already seen, but with one little bit of extra detail, and that was there in verse 21. This horn made war with the saints and prevailed over them. There is a picture of war being against the saints, the people of God. Now, what we need to do some more work on over subsequent times will be look at, well, who is this referring to? Is this the church? Is this God's covenant people, Israel? And so on. But regardless, these are saints. These are the people of God, whichever ethnic group or otherwise you may think. But this horn is making war with the saints. Is he succeeding? Well, according to this, he is. He is prevailing over them. There is a prevailing. So these saints will come under judgment and persecution, and they won't win yet. Until, and that's where we have in verse 22, until the Ancient of Days, and then Judgment Day happens. And so the Ancient of Days and passing the authority then to the Son of Man to take the rule and reign. So this is all that extra detail, But again, that word until shows us that God is sovereign and in control of all these events of human history, in spite of these great boasts of this little horn. And so Daniel, wanting to know more, again, he doesn't have enough information yet. He wants to go deeper. Verse 23 through to 26. Thus he said, as for the fourth beast, there shall be a fourth kingdom on earth, which shall be different from all the kingdoms, and it shall devour the whole earth, and trample it down, and break it to pieces. As for the 10 horns, out of this kingdom 10 kings shall arise, and another shall arise after them. He shall be different from the former ones, and shall put down 3 kings. He shall speak words against the Most High, and shall wear out the saints of the Most High, and shall think to change the times and the law. And they shall be given into his hand for a time, times, and half a time. But the court shall sit in judgment, and his dominion shall be taken away, to be consumed and destroyed to the end. Now, the depiction of this beast given here actually matches the details that we have in the book of Revelation. Of this beast, 10 horns, a little horn coming up. So again, Daniel's introducing this revelation and the vision given to John by Jesus Christ and so on. We actually see that depicted then for us later at the end of the Bible there. But here note that this fourth kingdom, the Roman kingdom, it's different from all the others. And in fact, it was quite different in the way its makeup and the way it was ruled and reigned and so on. Because the Roman Empire actually went through a number of different phases. Whilst it seemed strong, they did go through a series and a sequence of different kings and emperors and Caesars and so on. But the different phases, in a way, is depicted by how it gives way to the feet. If you remember the statue of Nebuchadnezzar at the end of the 2 legs, after the Roman Empire divides between the east and the west, we've then got the feet of part iron and part clay. Not really strong, but mixed together and rather fragile and brittle. This does depict a lot of what the Roman Empire looked like then for a subsequent several hundred years after Christ. And in fact, it didn't actually go away, but we've got this loose depiction of these feet. And these are loose alliances then throughout the Roman Empire. But here at this point, that opinions diverge. And we will have different interpretations of what this beast means, and even to the account and what we read in Revelation. And often those depictions, or this diverging of views, is often based really on some of the wrong things, our assumptions and presuppositions. As I said before, we need to let the Bible interpret the Bible first and foremost. But it comes to how we then deal with prophetic texts in particular. Because there are those that would say that Revelation and books like this, when Israel is in a foreign land or under persecution, it's merely apocalyptic literature. It's wishful thinking. Or in a way, they're writing in a way that's using much symbol, as if to say this is describing how they're feeling and certain events that will take place after this. And sadly, what often happens is that these events are largely dismissed as purely symbolic. Of the different views and approaches to studying Bible prophecy, there are 4 of them. One would be just taking a literal approach. As I said, if the plain sense makes perfect or common sense, seek no other sense, or it leads to nonsense. Because that's just simply saying, what does the Bible say? How do we let the Bible interpret the Bible? And in fact, it was the view of the early church for the first few hundred years after Christ that they held to a literal reading and understanding of Revelation. Of all the debate around rapture and things aside, the early church believed that when Christ returned, and it would be imminent, he would set up his kingdom for 1,000 years, just as Revelation chapter 20 says. But there are other views that came to the fore a few hundred years later, in perhaps the 4th century onward, as Christianity became the primary religion of the empire, the official religion of the empire. The church shifted in its thinking, well, hang on a minute, maybe God's done with Israel, and now it's all about the church. And much of that was based on Greek thinking and culture of the day out of Alexandria and so on, where they would actually then interpret many of those things symbolically. Saying the church has replaced Israel. All these promises, they're all symbolic. And therefore we can essentially dismiss a lot of Revelation to perhaps just a time of persecution and a message of hope to Christians through the ages. And of those different views, you'll have what's essentially an idealist position, or those that would take an historical view or a preterist view to think that these events were all fulfilled in AD 70 at the fall of the temple. But the thing is, a lot of those views, they deny a simple, plain, literal reading of the scripture because it doesn't fit the framework or the logical thinking that they have, thinking the church has replaced Israel. At the core, it actually gets down to covenant theology. What is God's covenant promise to Abraham and to David? And if those things are not understood, then we can think of covenants in a different sense. And covenant theology today is in a way suggesting that the church has replaced Israel and God is done with Israel. There's nothing more, but the promises all transfer to the church, not the curses of the old covenants and the law, just the blessings. But here, that view of to think that this is all symbolic, it's leaping to certain conclusions which are based, in my view, on presuppositions and many assumptions. One, that the Roman Empire has gone away. In fact, at the time of Jesus Christ, when those that hold that view would say that the stone came and destroyed the statue, but Rome was in full power, Jesus didn't actually depose the Romans at that time and his kingdom filled the earth. There is, in a sense, a symbolic view of Christ is ruling and reigning from heaven. But what about Christ's second coming? And that's something we'd addressed when we looked at the statue in Daniel chapter 2. But the thing is, as we look at those events through history, Rome didn't go away. The kingdom, the Roman Empire, did not divide still for several centuries. And it never actually went away. And then, but the assumption though is that this also then, with that going away, the age of the Gentiles, as we also read in Bible prophecy, also ended. These empires are done away with and now we have Christ ruling and reigning. But the thing is, that is also then assuming then that the church is ruling and reigning and having all authority. But as I said, Rome never actually went away. And even to this day, we have a loose alliance of nations, in a way, very much like the Roman Empire as it was, still in the background. We see forming of different nations. Even you look at the UN, people entering and exiting the UN, and you look at Brexit and other things, there's constant change. Look at the rules and those wanting to join with NATO. Look at the alliances of different nations through the Middle East, as we see even potentially the world stage being set for Ezekiel 38 and 39 to be fulfilled. There is actually much in the world that's going on today that when we look at the Bible, we go, wow, God knew what he was doing, because we actually have an answer to what is happening in the world. It's not nonsense. It's not crazy. God foretold it. His hand is on all these events. And we see these things happening. And so that's where, if you take a literal reading of Revelation and Daniel and so on, you lead to that logical conclusion that these must be future. And those are some of the things that we start to look at in verse 24, because out of this kingdom, it says, will be 10 horns that shall arise. So moving from the fourth beast, we'll zoom in a little bit and look in more detail at these horns. These 10 horns shall arise, and another shall arise after them. He shall be different from the former ones, and shall put down 3 kings. He shall speak against the Most High, shall wear out the saints of the Most High, shall think to change, the times and the law, and they shall be given into his hand for a time, times, and half a time. Have we seen anything that looks like these 10 horns ever in world history? And so those that would hold to a different view will suggest that this is a succession of emperors and Caesars and so on throughout Rome's history. But note, when we get to the end of the statue and these horns, they actually all arise at the same time. So logically, and in a literal sense, it can't be past events. It has to be future. We've never seen 10 kings ruling the world. Now, whether it's literal 10 kings or perhaps 10 powers, we look at things like the World Economic Forum and the World Health Organization. I mean, that could be a fulfillment of it. You don't know. And I guess we'll see as time plays out. But either way, we've never seen these 10 kings on the world stage as yet. And so when we look at that, these rise together like they do at the end of the feet and at the end of this last age. And moving on from there, though, there is one other horn that will arise after these 10. But this one's different, and there is more detail that is going to come as we get then later to chapter 9. But of that one horn, there are some initial details here, and there are a number of shall statements. The first is, he shall arise, but there are 5 other shall statements. This is not a maybe. This is not a perhaps. Oh, if events work out a certain way. God has decreed that these things are going to happen, and this is what this horn is going to do. The first of those is that he shall overthrow 3 of those other kings. So again, it can't be a sequence and a sequence of kings. That needs to be 3 at the same time overthrown. Secondly, too, he's actually going to speak words against the Most High God. These are going to be words of blasphemy, of essentially putting him in the place of God. Thirdly, a third shall is that he is going to wear out the saints. We already looked at that back in verse 21. He's going to make war with the saints and prevail over them. So he's going to wear out the saints of God. Fourthly, we also understand him that he's going to try and change the times and the law. There was a reference back in Daniel chapter 2, verse 21, of God being the one that's in control of the times and the seasons. But here, this particular horn is going to assume himself to be in the place of God, uttering great boasts and many things. But note, the fifth thing is that he shall have very limited success. It will be for time, times, and half a time. Now, we'll need to spend more time on that at another time, but in essence, what essentially when we look at time, times, and half a time is time would be 1 year. Times we understand as 2 years, and a half a time is a half a year. Put that together and we look at the Jewish calendar and Bible prophecy and all other things, the most common view is that this relates to 3.5 years, or 1,260 days, or 42 months. So when you see any of those things used together, where have we seen those in the Bible? Here in Daniel, also in Revelation. But his rule and his reign is really for no more than 3.5 years. How does that fit into the rest of it? And again, we're going to unpack that as we move along. But just a couple of details, and I can't help myself. We have to turn to Revelation. Would you turn with me for a brief moment to Revelation chapter 13? Because there is some additional detail then that Revelation adds, which marries perfectly with what we've just been looking at with regard to this horn in Daniel. Revelation 13, and we'll just look at the first 8 verses or so here. And we'll have to do this quickly, but what the Apostle John is saying here is, "And I saw a beast rising out of the sea," there's the sea again, "with 10 horns, 7 heads, 10 diadems on its horns, and blasphemous names on its heads. And the beast I saw was like a leopard, its feet were like a bear's, its mouth was like a lion's." Again, the pictures are just starting to summarize themselves for us. "And it said to the dragon," another picture, by the way, of Satan, "and it gave to the dragon its power and throne and great authority. One of its heads seemed to have a mortal wound, but its mortal wound was healed. And the whole earth marveled as they followed the beast. And they worshipped the dragon, for he had given his authority to the beast. And they worshipped the beast, saying, 'Who is like the beast? Who can fight against it?' And the beast was given a mouth uttering haughty and blasphemous words, and it was allowed to exercise authority for time, times, and half a time. That is 42 months. It marries up perfectly. It opened its mouth to utter blasphemies against God," something Daniel had spoken about, "blaspheming his name and his dwelling, that is, those who dwell in heaven. Also, it was allowed to make war on the saints and to conquer them, and authority was given to it over every tribe and people and language and nation. And all who dwell on earth will worship it, everyone whose name has not been written before the foundation of the world in the book of life from the Lamb who was slain. If anyone has an ear, let him hear." Do you have ears to hear this morning what God's saying? Because here in Revelation it's exactly mirroring what we've just looked at in Daniel 7. Also briefly, let's turn to Revelation 17. Verses 12 to 14 also give us a little more detail on those 10 horns. And the 10 horns that you saw are 10 kings who have not yet received royal power. Now, at the time of John being given this, these are future events to John. So to this point, it cannot relate to any of the prior kings and Caesars and rulers. It has to be a future event. And again, as I said, we haven't seen those. But again, it's saying it's not yet come. It's for a future time. They have not yet received royal power, but they are to receive authority as kings for 1 hour. That is for a brief period of time together with the beast. These are of one mind. They shall hand over their power and authority to the beast. They will make war on the Lamb, and the Lamb will conquer them, for he is Lord of lords, King of kings, and those with him are called and chosen and faithful. So looking back again to Daniel, you can see the similarities between these two accounts. As we then progress through this account here, in verse 26 is when his time of reckoning comes, of when judgment will occur. But the court shall sit in judgment, and his dominion shall be taken away to be consumed and destroyed to the end. That leads us finally to this last and final kingdom. Verse 27, and the kingdom and the dominion and the greatness of the kingdoms under the whole earth shall be given to the people of the saints of the Most High. His kingdom shall be an everlasting kingdom, and all dominions shall serve and obey him. If you wanted to look up later the cross references, that is Revelation 20, when Jesus Christ will come, overthrow the armies of the world and set up his kingdom for 1,000 years. If you were to read that in a literal, numerical sense. But this is the fulfillment of his kingdom to fulfill all the promises God made in those old covenants to Abraham, to David, and so on. In essence here, then we conclude in verse 28 with the end of the dream. Here, this is the end of the matter. As for me, Daniel, my thoughts greatly alarmed me. My colour changed, but I kept the matter in my heart. So by way of summary, we're looking at a series of events adding more colour and detail to the prior dream of Nebuchadnezzar. Here Daniel's dreaming details specific to these 4 nations, begin of things that are future events that are unpacked for us in further detail in the book of Revelation. But I know I've given you a lot this morning. It might be a bit of overload. So what I thought to do is just give you a visual representation of a graphic that I lifted from an earlier series when we looked at an introduction to Bible prophecy. And so if you haven't heard that, I'd encourage you to go back and have a listen to those or a re-listen to those. But in essence, what we understand when we take a literal, plain reading of Scripture is that throughout history, from the time of Daniel right through to the end of the age and beyond, there are essentially 5 eras or ages throughout history. From the time of Daniel until the time of Christ, or from Babylon to Christ, we've essentially got a depiction of those first 4 kingdoms. And that in the bottom of that diagram there you see the first, second, and third and fourth beasts. The Babylonian Empire, followed by the Medo-Persian Empire, followed by the Greek Empire and the Roman and so on. But that continued through to the time of Christ. But something unknown to the time of Daniel and unknown to the Old Testament, but as the New Testament tells us through the apostles and the epistles, there is a mystery that's been revealed, that God would turn his attention to the church. And we're in the midst of the church age. So whilst to the time of Christ that was all past, at the present we're in a church age. It began at the day of Pentecost, and it will conclude with the time that Christ comes back for his church. Teaching and doctrine and thoughts of the rapture aside, it is the view of this church and many that hold a literal view that a rapture of the church will occur most likely before a tribulation, or it could happen in the middle or at the end, and that is open to debate. So I'll just put that out there. Our view, though, and my view, is primarily that it makes most sense for a rapture of the church to occur before the tribulation. Because this tribulation is something that is also depicted for us later in Daniel, we'll get to, but even Jesus himself spoke of a time of great distress that would come on the world that's never been seen and will never be seen ever again. None of the past world wars or anything in history will match those details of those events. Because this is something we will look at as we work through Daniel, but that tribulation is best understood as occurring for 7 years. divided in two halves, 3.5 and 3.5. What does 3.5 resemble? Times and half a time, 42 months, 1,260 days. And essentially, we can start a stopwatch based on certain events that Revelation teaches us in more detail. But even Jesus himself speaks of a time of tribulation yet to come. But it's at the end of that tribulation, and these events that we've looked at is at the beginning and end. Revelations 4 and 5, and also Revelation 20, is where the judgment falls out, is poured out rather on the earth through seals, bowls, trumpets, and all these other judgments upon the inhabitants of the earth. Why? To bring Israel back into covenant. And this is something we learned, and I mentioned this previously at the end of Romans 11 and also Zechariah and other Old Testament prophets. There will be a day of national repentance of the nation of Israel. At that point, Christ will return with the saints, and he will set up his kingdom. It's a messianic reign for 1,000 years to fulfill all his covenant promises to Israel. And again, in that earlier series, there are hundreds of prophecies all throughout the Old Testament, major and minor prophets, which speak about what the earth will look like in that time. Again, I'd encourage you to go back and look at those. But at the end of the 1,000 years is when is the great white throne judgment. All the dead who do not know the Lord, they will be raised again and will face judgment and will go to an eternity in the lake of fire, where the false prophet and the beast and all those other characters will already be. But these are essentially 5 stages from Babylon to Christ. The clock stops at that point because Jesus is crucified. We begin the church age. And when the fullness of Gentiles comes in, the tribulation will begin. And that will go for a period of 7 years, as most commonly understood, following which we have a 1,000-year reign of Christ and eternity. Marry that with what we just looked at this morning, going through the story. The first 4 beasts, giving their way sometime in the future to 10 toes or 10 horns, of which one will arise, utter great boasts and blasphemies against God. But he will only rule and reign for 3.5, the latter 3.5 years of that period of tribulation. Christ will come back and do away with him and set up his eternal kingdom. There's no if, no but, no maybe. This is the sovereign hand of God over all the events of history. And to conclude this morning, what I'd just simply like to do is read for you Psalm 2, which summarizes really the essence of the way God sees this. Why do the nations rage and the peoples plot in vain? The kings of the earth set themselves and the rulers take counsel together against the Lord and against his anointed, saying, let us burst their bonds apart and cast away their cords from us. He who sits in the heavens laughs. The Lord holds them in derision. Then he will speak to them in his wrath and terrify them in his fury, saying, as for me, I have set my king on Zion, my holy hill. I will tell of the decree. The Lord said to me, you are my son. Today I have begotten you. Ask of me, and I will make the nations your heritage and the ends of the earth your possession. You shall break them with a rod of iron and dash them to pieces like a potter's vessel. Now therefore, O kings, be wise, be warned. O rulers of the earth, serve the Lord with fear and rejoice with trembling. Kiss the Son, lest he be angry and you perish in the way, for his wrath is quickly kindled. But blessed are all who take refuge in him. Our dear Heavenly Father, we do thank you for these words. And whilst this story, this dream is really detailed, we pray, God, too, as we sit with this, we will just be a reminder that you are sovereign and Lord over all. You have decreed the end from the beginning, and Lord, even too, may this stir our hearts to be even more bold, sharing the gospel of the good news of Jesus Christ to those around us whilst there's time. And we pray, Lord, too, that as we progress through the rest of this book, all the pieces will fit into place. That in all things we could give you the glory, honor, and praise, knowing that you are sovereign, that you rule and reign, and our lives are in your hands. And we commit this to you now in the name of Jesus, we pray. Amen.